Okay, well, lovely to speak to you, and I presented the overall regression results for this yesterday, the overall predictive model for weight loss maintenance. So today's talk really focuses a little more on emotion regulation, self-regulation, and the relationships amongst them in the process of change during weight loss maintenance. So if anyone here also saw my talk yesterday, it will not be exactly the same. I'm sure you're relieved to hear. So first of all, I've got no conflicts of interest to disclose. And also this slide seems to go slowly, so let's see if we can, there we go, we've changed. So I've been involved in building the evidence foundation for this intervention, which is work with separate samples of participants. So none of the people I worked with are those that took part in the trial. What I will report today is results from a 12-month longitudinal study of people who were trying to maintain weight in the UK. So again, these are not trial participants, it's a study of naturalistic weight maintenance in the population that had already achieved their goal weight. The key research questions I will speak to today are within the context of the fact that we still don't know what are the population determinants of sustained weight loss maintenance in general population samples where weight loss has not happened through an RCT. And our study benefits from having objective weight measurements rather than just self-report, which tends to be the case with general population surveys. So today I will speak to relationships between weight loss maintenance and self-regulatory variables, relationships between weight loss maintenance and emotion regulatory variables, and finally, last but not least, how these two things seem to interrelate over time, how they change together over the process of maintenance. So the data I report today are for 2,352 participants who gave us data at 3 time points. These time points were 0 months, baseline, 6 months, and 12 months. And it includes primarily a sample of women. There are about 2,100 women and about 200 men. Men were very much underrepresented in this sample. But I've examined these relationships split by gender, and actually you do see very similar relationships, which was interesting. For these individuals, we got objective weight data at all 3 time points from weight records held by a slimming organisation that people had lost weight with. This is a slimming organisation people had spontaneously joined. It wasn't a trial they came into. We simply contacted them using the slimming organisation's mailing list and invited them to be part of this observational study of maintenance. We also asked them about some psychological and behavioural variables, and these are some of the ones that we asked about. I will speak specifically about the regulatory variables, self-regulation and emotion, but we also got the weight history, talked about habits, adherence to weight management plans, their eating, physical activity, and various other things. So this is what the distribution of weight loss maintenance looks like. So we can see that at 6 months, people had gained under 1 kilo from their starting weight. And at 12 months, on average, people had gained about 1.5 kilos with standard deviations that were about double the initial gains. And what you can see in the histogram is actually some people lost quite a lot more, but the majority of people were staying around their goal point. We checked that these were people who were trying to maintain by asking about their motivation to lose more weight. Broadly, most had absolutely no motivation to lose more weight, but extremely high motivation to maintain it. So we think we've got quite close to a true maintainer sample, as much as we possibly can, within the context of this sort of survey. And people had lost, on average, about 15% of their body weight. So even if they did regain a little, 90% of people remained 5% below that start weight before they'd lost weight. In other words, they would be considered to have maintained clinically significant weight loss over the 12-month period. So we had a lot of very successful maintenance within the sample. So we found that physical activity actually increased over the study as assessed using moderate vigorous physical activity minutes per week. Explicit intended dietary restraint actually decreased, and intuitive eating responding to biological hunger cues, that sort of thing, increased. we found that the explicit levels of planning and motivational variables for weight loss maintenance decreased over the study. You would potentially expect this because people may be planning less explicitly, less formally, less effortfully as they get better at maintaining. Planning potentially becomes more intuitive and less articulated. We also found that emotion dysregulation, stress, and depressive symptoms decreased over the course of the study. So I apologise for all the correlational tables, but I will tell you the broad brush stories. So if you look at the baseline levels of all these self-regulatory variables, you've got action control, which is the extent to which you exert executive functional control of your weight management activities. You've got action planning and coping planning, so that's setting out plans for weight loss maintenance and planning for when stuff might go wrong. That's coping planning. Self-efficacy, so the belief that you can maintain weight. The automaticity of healthy eating, how habitual are those healthy eating choices? And levels of motivation. Autonomous motivation is the motivation you experience coming from within yourself, being self-guided. Controlled motivation is the expectation that other people would like you to do things. So you can see one is somewhat intrinsic, and the second is somewhat extrinsic. You can also see that overall motivation for weight loss maintenance is represented here. When we look at the baseline scores, you can see that we're getting some statistical significance because it's an enormous sample, but these are very weak correlations. As such, baseline levels of this sort of activity were relatively unpredictive of weight loss maintenance at the 12-month point. So baseline predictors were really not accounting for very much variance in weight loss maintenance. However, when you look at the change in the self-regulatory variables, you see a different study. And one thing I should apologise for now is that we have 3 sneaky asterisks that have come down here that should not be in the table. I do apologise, it's my 3rd talk in 2 days. So what we see is this far stronger association in change in self-regulation with weight loss maintenance, such that people who exerted lower levels of self-regulatory control, they actually gained more weight. People whose self-efficacy dropped over the period gained more weight. People whose motivation decreased gained more weight. The only exception was controlled motivation here, despite what the asterisks say. Levels of controlled motivation didn't make so much of a difference, but autonomous motivation, that intrinsic internal motivation to maintain weight, was strongly linked to weight loss maintenance. So what we're seeing is the change scores account for the process of maintaining weight to a greater extent, and we're beginning now to do the mediation and moderation analyses to tease out some of these relationships statistically. The data are relatively recently received, so I apologise for not presenting these mediation analyses here. So those are the self-regulatory variables. What we see now are the emotion regulation variables. So you've got emotion dysregulation, the inability to manage emotions effectively. You've got depressive symptoms and stress which speak for themselves. You have self-criticism, the extent to which you criticise yourself, and then self-compassion, which would be the inverse, a compassionate attitude to yourself. And then you have 3 types of eating represented here. You have binge eating, grazing, which would be picking on stuff through the day but not compulsively eating a large amount, and then eating in the absence of hunger, which would be eating despite not feeling physically hungry. Again, the associations of these levels at baseline with weight loss maintenance are relatively weak. We are hitting statistical significance, but these are fairly trivial correlations. What we see is that there is far less of a relationship with the change scores compared to the self-regulatory variables. So motion regulation is not accounting for a great deal of change in weight loss maintenance. These change scores here, because of the way we calculated them, we did see that there is a weak link between increased binge eating severity, increased eating in the absence of hunger, and weight gain. But again, it's relatively low. So we're not seeing the relationships we saw with the self-regulatory variables. This seems to suggest that the self-regulatory variables may be more actively involved in the process of maintaining weight. And finally, we have the relationship between the two. This is the last correlation table, I do promise. So what we saw is emotion regulation was particularly strongly associated, although these are still relatively weak correlations, with the self-regulatory variables, such that people who had higher levels of emotion dysregulation were doing less planning. They had lower self-efficacy, eating was less habitual for them. They had higher controlled motivation, so people who were emotionally dysregulated have extrinsic reasons for maintaining weight, and they had fewer intrinsic reasons for trying to maintain weight. And what we saw was overall motivation was related there. You see very, very, very similar relationships with depression and stress. In other words, the higher the level of emotional dysregulation, the lower the level of self-regulation. And these are change scores. So as emotional dysregulation, stress, and depression went up, levels of self-regulatory variables across the board basically decreased. In other words, there seems to be sort of a trade-off. If you are emotionally regulating well, you are perhaps able to exert these self-regulatory behaviours on your maintenance process. But if you have high levels of depression, stress, inability to manage your emotions, then the ability to enact these regulatory behaviours that you need to keep your weight in the right place, those are diminished. And again, we're modelling how these things work together and predicting weight loss maintenance at the moment. But it seems that there is an interaction there. It's not simple additive contributions to the whole thing. So let me see if I can, yes. So I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at Newcastle, Falkish Niehotter, Kirby Sainsbury, and all the partners in the NoHoW Consortium, many of whom are represented here today. And thank you for listening. I would appreciate any questions at this preliminary stage of looking at the data.
Thank you very much, Liz, for sharing this with us. Questions for Liz? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Katja. I'm from Denmark, from Novo Nordisk, actually.
Hello.
Very, very interesting results. Just to help me to put them together.
Yeah.
Do your results basically mean that if you measure executive function at the beginning of the intervention, you can then maybe stratify your populations to specific toolkits or parts of your toolkit?
That's an absolutely intriguing suggestion. We didn't take direct executive function measures, so action control would be the extent to which you would use your executive faculties to plan out, to sort of implement your weight management. So if I speak to that, then I would say that baseline levels are relatively trivial when it comes to predicting weight loss maintenance success, because those correlations were really quite low. Yep. What I did find and what I reported in my talk yesterday was that emotion dysregulation at baseline was a significant predictor of overall weight loss maintenance. So if anything, it would be more important potentially to measure emotion dysregulation as opposed to the more self-regulatory activities at baseline as a guide to how weight maintenance might go and where you might offer support. Yep. So we seem to support lots of self-regulation in our interventions because many of us are health psychologists. But actually emotion regulation might be one of the things that would be most important to know about people at baseline. But I can see there being a whole different project where we look at cognitive faculties of people before they start interventions. And in fact, I'm sure there is some good literature on that. So really interesting idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure, James.
In data sets like this, there's usually quite a big attrition effect.
Yeah.
So, and it's a weight loss maintenance data set, which should constrain the variance in the outcome as it progresses longitudinally. One, how does that affect the models? And two, what can we do with the missing data?
I don't know. I mean, A, I'm not a statistician, and they would definitely be the right person to answer this. But B, our attrition was not that high in this sample. Right. We have baseline email addresses from people, about 3,000 of them, and then 2,300 gave us data for the rest of the study. So I'm not anticipating it being that hard to model because also levels of missingness within participants were really quite low. I think it's, without a doubt, we're going to have to be using growth curve modelling, particularly if we use detailed weight records for people, where we've got 52 weights for some people in the year preceding joining the study, and for others we have 3 weights. So that I don't know how to navigate. But all I can say is probably complex. It's probably complex. Do you have some ideas?
I think, well, it strikes me that because it's a weight loss maintenance data set and the concept of weight loss maintenance is nothing's going to happen, the ones who successfully do it means that the variance in outcomes is constrained.
Yeah, we also can't do baseline outcome carried forward because that would equal maintenance, which is precisely not what you don't want to be doing.
But I think there are, you could make assumptions to interpolate the missing data. You could assume that there's the last observation carried forward. You could assume that those from the last observation regain certain amounts. So and there are multiple methods which would probably be useful to compare.
I think we have to use a number of different ones and see the extent to which they influence our outcomes, and then make a pragmatic decision based on that.
So you know what the effect of the assumptions is.
Absolutely. If various methods make virtually no difference to our outcomes, it hopefully will be an academic question, literally and figuratively.
Okie doke. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for listening.